The morning I got fired, I was already carrying three things: a box of desk supplies, 2 weeks of unpaid overtime, and the very specific kind of humiliation that comes from being escorted out of a building you helped keep solvent for 6 years. The security guard's name was Ted. He'd watched me fix the payroll system at 2 in the morning during the Christmas audit. He didn't make eye contact when he held the door. I didn't cry. I was too tired to cry. That's the thing no one tells you about hitting rock bottom. It's not dramatic. It's just very, very quiet. My name is Maeve. I'm 28 years old. I have a bachelor's degree in accounting, a minor in applied mathematics, and as of 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in March, absolutely no income. The firm was called Alderton and Crane. Tax consulting, mid-sized, the kind of place that used words like family in the employee handbook, and then laid off 12 people 2 weeks before the fiscal year closed to clean up their own books. I was number 11. My manager, who had signed my last 3 performance reviews with phrases like indispensable and exceptional numerical instinct, shook my hand and said the decision wasn't personal. His name was Daniel. He'd been sleeping with my colleague Britta for 4 months. Britta was number 12 on nobody's list. I took the bus home. I sat in the back because the heat vent was back there, and my coat had a broken zipper, and it was March in Toronto, which means the cold's maternal. It means the cold has your address. The box sat on my lap. A stapler, a photo of my mother from before she got sick, a backup charger that only worked if you held it at a precise 45-degree angle and didn't breathe wrong. The accumulated treasures of 6 years. My apartment was a 1-bedroom on Gerrard Street with a radiator that ticked all night and a neighbor who practiced drums between 10 and midnight with what I can only describe as genuine commitment. It was mine. Barely. The rent was going up in May. I sat on the floor. Not the couch, the floor, because sometimes your body just knows, and I did the math. Savings. 3 months, maybe 4 if I stopped eating like a person. Outstand. Student loan, credit card from the root canal in November, first and last if I had to move. Prospects. Unclear. The consulting sector was contracting. I had references from a firm that had just restructured itself into a smaller, more dishonest version of itself. I was good at numbers. The numbers were not good. My phone rang. I looked at it. It was my sister. I let it ring. Corinne and I had not spoken since December, specifically since the night of our mother's birthday dinner when Corinne announced she was moving into Mum's house to help with her care, which would have been touching if our mother hadn't told me 3 days later that Corinne had asked her to update the will. Mum said she didn't want to make it a whole thing. I said okay. I paid for the birthday dinner and took the train home in the dark. We'd grown up with not much. That's the clean way to say it. There are worse ways. Dad was gone by the time I was 7. Mum worked 2 jobs. Corinne was 5 years older and she had this particular skill. She still has it, of positioning herself near warmth, near people who had things. She didn't take, exactly. She just arranged herself to receive. I'd spent my whole life arranging myself to earn. I didn't call her back. Instead, I opened my laptop and started updating my resume, which is the adult equivalent of doing something so you don't have to feel the thing you're feeling. I was deep in the skills section, debating whether advanced Excel proficiency sounded desperate or merely precise when my email pinged. It was from a recruiter I'd never contacted. Subject line, urgent, financial controller position. Confidential client. I almost deleted it. I had a rule about unsolicited recruiters that I'd developed after 3 separate experiences with companies that turned out to be either pyramid schemes or, in one memorable case, a vitamin supplement operation run out of a storage unit in Scarborough. But the email was articulate. No exclamation points. No promises of uncapped earning potential. It described a private holdings company seeking a controller with forensic accounting experience, offered a salary that made me read the number twice, and said the role was to begin immediately. Immediately was the word that got me. I replied. The interview was 2 days later, in a building on Bay Street that didn't have a sign, not a subtle sign, not a small plaque, no sign at all. Just a glass door and a lobby with marble floors and a woman at the front desk who smiled with her mouth and not her eyes, and asked me to leave my phone in a locker before I went up. I should have left at that point. I want to be honest about that. Every reasonable instinct I had said to take my resume and go get a coffee and think very carefully about whether immediately was worth whatever this was. I left out my phone in the locker and went. The office on the 14th floor was quiet, the way expensive things are quiet. Not silent, quiet. The carpet absorbed sound. The furniture was the kind that didn't announce itself. Through a wall of windows, I could see the lake, grey and flat, and the faint suggestion of snow coming in from the west. There were two men waiting. One introduced himself as a senior advisor and asked me questions about forensic audits and reconciliation procedures for 40 minutes. The questions were good, specific. Whoever had designed them understood numbers. The other man sat at the far end of the table and did not introduce himself. He had dark hair going grey at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been decided on rather than grown, and a scar that started below his left ear and disappeared into his collar. He held a pen and didn't write anything. He just watched. I gave my answers to the advisor and tried not to look at the man who wasn't speaking. I failed at that. Near the end, the advisor thanked me and said someone would be in touch. I stood up and was 3 steps toward the door when the man at the end of the table spoke for the first time. "You caught an error," he said. I stopped. "In the sample reconciliation we sent with the brief." His voice was low and even, the kind that didn't go up at the end of sentences. "Line 47, a transposition, 12,000 moved to the wrong column. You noticed it, you didn't mention it." I turned around. I wasn't sure if it was a test. It was. He looked at me the way people look at locks when they're deciding whether to bother picking them. "Was there anything else?" "Line 93, I said. "The amortization schedule doesn't match the asset register. It's a small gap, about $400, but it's consistent, same amount, 3 consecutive quarters. That's not rounding error. That's a pattern." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, more like the absence of dismissal. "The position is yours," he said, "if you want it." I started the following Monday. His name, his last name, which was the only name anyone used in that office, was Karev. I learned this in increments, the way you learn the rules of a place that doesn't post them. You watched who deferred to whom. You noticed what got said in front of you and what stopped when you entered a room. You counted the security cameras, which is a habit I had from growing up somewhere that had a lot of them, pointed outward, at people like us. The company was called Halcyon Group. On paper, it was a private equity and asset management firm. There was a real portfolio, real estate, a logistics company, 2 restaurant groups, a stake in a small shipping operation out of Halifax. I audited these legitimately for 2 weeks before I understood that they were the visible part. The invisible part was harder to see and easier to feel, the way certain meetings happened after hours, the way specific accounts had codes I didn't have access to and wasn't meant to ask about, the way men came to the office who didn't work there, sat with Karev for 40 minutes, and left without signing in. I'm an accountant. I understand ledgers. I understand that every organization has a ledger you see and a ledger you don't, and the gap between them is where the truth lives. Halcyon's gap was larger than most. I chose, in those first weeks, not to look directly at it, the way you don't look directly at the sun. I did my job. I found 3 additional discrepancies in the historical accounts that my predecessor had missed, documented them, and presented them to Karev's advisor without editorial comment. The advisor looked at me the way you look at a stray cat that has just solved a Sudoku. He told Karev. Karev called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. It was the first time I'd been in there alone with him. The office had no artwork, just the windows of ledgers. Physical ledgers, the old kind. I thought that was either very old-fashioned or very deliberate. "You found the Marsden accounts," he said. "I found 3 accounts with irregular disbursement patterns and no corresponding entries in the asset register," I said. "I didn't label them. The man who set them up was taking from me." Karev said. "He's not a concern anymore." I didn't ask what that meant. I'm going to be honest. I didn't ask because I already understood in the way you understand things your mind hasn't yet decided to think directly about. There was a very particular quality to the phrase, "not a concern anymore," in this office. It had weight. It had finality. "All right," I said. "All right," he repeated. Something in his voice sounded like he hadn't expected that answer. "Most people ask. Most people are looking for permission to run," I said. "I'm not running. I'm asking if there are other accounts with similar structures I should be aware of." He looked at me for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "I'll have them sent to you." That should have been the end of a professional interaction. It was the beginning of something else, though I didn't know that yet, and I suspect he didn't either. The accounts he sent were a problem, not because they were fraudulent. They were Karev's own, structured the way private money gets structured when it cannot be fully explained to anyone who hasn't agreed to certain arrangements. The problem was that 3 of them were flagged, not by the government, by someone else. Someone who had been watching, who understood the structure almost as well as I did, and who had placed markers in specific transactions the way a hunter places trail signs. I found the markers on a Wednesday night. I often was by then, because I liked the quiet, and I pulled the 3rd folder, and there they were. Small, deliberate, the kind of thing you only see if you're looking for the thing no one told you to look for. I sat there for a while with my hands flat on the desk. Then I wrote up a full report, cross-referenced every flagged transaction, identified the marker pattern, and estimated when the surveillance had begun. I left it on Karev's desk before I went home. He called me at 6 in the morning. Not the advisor, him. "Come in," he said. I came in. He was already there, which meant he hadn't gone home. He was standing at the windows when I entered, hands behind his back, looking at the lake. The sun was just coming up. The ice was breaking up out past the islands, that grey-blue shift that meant spring was still undecided, but at least considering it. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since last night," I said. "I documented everything. It's all in the report." I read the report. He turned around. He looked tired, which I hadn't seen before. Not the ordinary kind of tired, the kind that accumulates over years. "Why did you bring it to me instead of walking out?" It wasn't a question, quite. "Because I've done the math," I said. "Walking out with this information is not safer than staying." He looked at me for a long time. "That's the first time anyone has said that to me and been right," he said. "Most people think running is the calculation. Running costs," I said. "It costs time, traction, all your references. I'd rather know what I'm inside than pretend I'm outside of it." Something shifted in his expression. I was getting better at reading him, which is not a skill I'd planned to develop. He sat down. He gestured at the chair across from him, the same chair from the interview. "Tell me what you'd do," he said, "if you were managing this problem." So I told him. For 40 minutes I laid out a restructuring of the flagged accounts, a migration strategy, a paper trail that would close cleanly. He asked questions. Good ones, the same quality as the interview, the kind that meant he already understood the shape of the thing and was testing whether I did. At the end he said, "I need someone I can trust with all of it. Not just the visible ledger. You trust the people who have no other options," I said. "That's all this is." "No," he said, and his voice was different then, quieter, more careful. "The people with no options run when they find one. You found one. You're still here. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure I had one for myself," he said. "I'm offering you a different arrangement. More access, corresponding responsibility, the kind that doesn't come with a formal title. What does it come with?" I asked, he said. "And an honest accounting of what you're agreeing to," which was, I thought, more than I'd ever gotten from Alderton and Crane. I said yes. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and I had previously lived through a period that included my mother's diagnosis, a car that died on the 401 in January, and a subletter who stole my blender. I say that as context. I learned things I had not expected to learn. I learned that Karev ran what he described as a syndicate, which was an older word than organization, and carried a different kind of weight. I learned that the people in that office were loyal in the particular way that comes from having made choices that bind you, not because they were threatened, but because Karev held to a code that was rigid and unyielding and fair in the way that very few other things in their lives had been. He paid what he owed. He didn't take what he hadn't agreed to. He kept the books in his way. I understood that about him. It was the thing that made sense to me, even when nothing else did. I also learned that someone had been watching his operation for 8 months. Not law enforcement. A rival. A man named Serge Aldous, who ran a competing network out of Montreal and had been embedding observers in Karev's supply chain for 2 quarters. The markers in the accounts were Aldous's, a signal to someone inside Halcyon that the information was being compiled, that the moment was coming. The someone inside Halcyon was Karev's second in command, a man called Marsh who'd been with him for 11 years. I found this on a Friday. I put it in a folder. I sat with the folder for 20 minutes, doing what I did with every hard thing, turning it over, looking at the angles, figuring out the cost of each possible move. The cost of telling Karev, unpredictable, Marsh was his oldest associate. I had no idea what 11 years meant in this world, whether it would make Karev doubt the evidence or act on it, or something else entirely. The cost of not telling him, certain. If Aldous moved and Karev didn't know, whatever protection I'd been offered meant nothing, because the thing protecting me was Karev's continued operation of this organization, and Marsh was dismantling it from the inside. I told him. I brought the folder into his office at 4 in the afternoon on a Friday in April, and I put it on his desk, and I said, "You need to read this before the weekend." He read it. He didn't say anything for a long time. I watched him the way you watch someone process something that is changing the shape of what they thought was true. "How certain are you?" he finally said. "The data is conclusive," I said. "I'll stake my professional reputation on it, which I understand is not the only thing at stake here, but it's mine to offer." He looked up at me. Something in his face was doing something I hadn't seen before. Not grief exactly. Something more like the weariness of a man who has been right too many times about people being capable of betrayal. "I gave him everything," Karev said. "It was not said to me, quite." "I know," I said. "He documented it. That's how I found it." He closed the folder. He said, "Go home, Maeve." It was the first time he'd used my first name. I went home. I did not sleep particularly well. I made tea and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the radiator and listened to it tick. And I thought about the life I'd had before the Tuesday morning with the box, and Ted, the security guard, not making eye contact. And I thought about how I had been so careful and so precise and so correct for so many years, and it had added up to nothing. A broken zippered coat, 3 months of savings, a resume no one was reading. And I thought about an office without artwork, and a man who balanced his books with a ruthlessness that was almost classical, and who had said you found one and you're still here like it was the most surprising thing anyone had ever done. My phone buzzed. It was Corinne. Not a call this time, a text. She'd apparently had a meeting with Mom's doctor, and there were decisions to be made and someone needed to be there, and she had a trip she couldn't change and she was so sorry, but she'd already told Mom I'd handle it. I put my phone face down. I thought, there are 2 kinds of people who decide what you're worth, the ones who know you and still get it wrong, and the ones who have no reason to value you at all and do it anyway, because the evidence is in front of them and they're not the kind of person who ignores evidence. I thought about which kind was rarer. I went back into the office on Monday. Marsh was not there. I did not ask about Marsh. Karev was already in his office when I arrived. He was on the phone, speaking quietly, and he raised one hand in acknowledgement when I walked past the glass wall, which was more than he'd ever done before. An hour later he came to the door of my office, not his usual configuration where people came to him. "The oldest situation is being managed," he said. "Okay," I said. "The accounts you restructured last month," he said. "They're clean?" "Fully reconciled," I said. "I can show you. I know you can." He stood in the doorway. He had this quality of occupying space differently than other people, not aggressively, not even consciously, just like he had thought carefully about where to be and then was there, fully. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "After Marsh. You had the information. You could have used it to leave." "It wasn't mine to use," I said. He looked at me the way he'd looked at me in the interview, like something was being weighed. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, which, coming from this man in this office, felt like a significant preamble. I'd prefer that, I said. I don't do things I haven't thought through, he said. I don't make decisions that aren't in my interest. That's not sentiment talking. It's the only way I've survived this long. He paused. You're the most valuable person in this organization right now. The accounts are cleaner than they've been in 4 years. You found Marsh, you stayed, those are professional accomplishments, I said. Yes, he said. They are. Another pause, so I'm saying something else also. I looked at him. He looked at me. The lake was doing that April thing outside the windows, going from grey to something almost blue, undecided. You're not good at this part, I said. Something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. It changed it. No, he said. I'm not. That's all right, I said. I'm good at the math and you're good at the rest of it. It seems like we might be useful to each other, he said. I was thinking something similar. Then we should probably talk about it, I said, like two people who deal in facts. So we did. It wasn't simple, and I won't pretend it was. The world he moved through had real weight to it, real consequence, and I was not someone who pretended costs didn't exist. I had spent my whole life accounting for costs. I knew what I was choosing and what it meant to choose it. But I also knew what I had before. The careful, diminishing, invisible arithmetic of a life where I did everything right, and it added up to a Tuesday morning and a box and a security guard who wouldn't look me in the eyes. I knew what it felt like to work for people who used the word family while they cleaned their books with your severance. Karev used none of those words. He said arrangement and value, and this is what I can offer, and this is what I'm asking in return. And somehow that plainness was the most trustworthy thing anyone had ever said to me. My mother's assessment of our situation, when I eventually told her something close to the truth, was characteristically direct. She'd had a long life and a difficult one, and she was not easily alarmed. She said, "Is he good to you?" I said, "He's honest with me." She said, "That's better." Corinne called twice that week. I let both calls go. There was a certain arithmetic to that, too, the calculation of what you owe someone who has spent a lifetime arranging to receive and never to give. Eventually, I sent a text that said I'd make my own arrangements for Mum's care, which I did. It cost money, I was, for the first time in a while, no longer short of. That's not the point. The point isn't money, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter. The point is that I sat in that empty apartment on Gerrard Street with a box of desk supplies and did the math on my own life, and it came up short. Not because I wasn't good enough, because I'd been spending myself in places that didn't understand what I was worth. The point is that sometimes the ledger that looks wrong from the outside is the one that actually balances. The ice finished breaking up on the lake sometime in late April. I watched it from the 14th floor on a morning that smelled like the first real thaw. That cold, wet smell that means things are shifting, that the calculation of winter is finally settling in favor of something else. Karev came to stand beside me at the window. He didn't say anything. He wasn't the type to fill silence unnecessarily, which I had come to regard as one of his better qualities. I said, "You know, for a man who runs a syndicate, your depreciation schedules are a mess," he said. "Is that what you're thinking about?" "I'm always thinking about the numbers," I said. "That's the job." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And the rest of it?" I looked at the lake, the light coming off it now, something warmer and more certain in it than there'd been for months. "The rest of it," I said, "is the best deal I've ever made.